Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
And we are so glad you're joining us for this.
Yeah, definitely. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are a military commander, and you've been tasked with conquering, the most heavily fortified, basically impenetrable city in the known world.
Right. Towering walls, barred gates.
Exactly. The inhabitants are heavily armed. And your grand strategic masterstroke, you instruct your entire army to just walk in a circle around the city.
Just walk.
Just walk in absolute eerie silence for 7 days. I mean, no siege engines, no battering rams, no arrows, just walking and waiting. It sounds, frankly, like an absolute joke.
It really does. It sounds like a surefire way to just get your entire army slaughtered, honestly.
Yeah. But this is actually the opening move in one of the most brilliant and probably misunderstood military campaigns in ancient history.
It completely upends every conventional assumption we have about conflict and strategy and, power. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a really deep dive into the book of Joshua.
Specifically, chapters 6 through 12, right?
Yes, exactly. Spanning chapters 6 through 12, we're examining the ancient conquest of Canaan. So this narrative, it moves from the logic-defying collapse of Jericho all the way through this grueling campaign that ends in the defeat of 31 kings.
31 kings. That's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. But our objective today is, well, it's far more than just an ancient history lesson. We're mining these texts alongside some profound classical commentaries from scholars like Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
Right.
We want to extract the raw, practical wisdom and the moral frameworks that apply directly to how you and I navigate our own seemingly insurmountable walls today.
And to really grasp the magnitude of what's happening here, we have to look at the actual data surrounding the people fighting these battles. Like, I was reading through the source notes on the Israelites' military capability at this moment, and it struck me.
Yeah, it's pretty sparse.
Very sparse. Like, we cannot think of them as a standing professional army. They're a nomadic population.
Right. They've just spent 4 decades wandering in a harsh desert environment.
Exactly. They are essentially a nation of tent dwellers. They don't possess, the heavy machinery of Bronze Age warfare.
No siege towers in their camp.
None. And yet they are staring across the Jordan River at these Canaanite city-states that are defined by massive fortified architecture.
So, how does a displaced nomadic people even begin to conceptualize an attack on a walled fortress like Jericho?
Well, the short answer is, from a purely tactical standpoint, they don't. The historical context is really vital here.
Okay, lay it out for us.
In the ancient Near East, walled cities were like the ultimate symbols of security and permanence. They were literally designed to withstand months, sometimes years of siege.
Yeah. So the Israelites' complete lack of siege weaponry, it forces a fundamental shift in the narrative. The text is making it explicitly clear that any success they have cannot be attributed to human military superiority.
Right, because they just don't have it.
Exactly. The entire campaign is framed around their absolute reliance on divine intervention and strict adherence to a covenant.
It's not about human might.
No, not at all. The formidable walls of Canaan are set up as this massive theological proving ground. It's this profound lesson that the most intimidating barriers in our lives, they aren't always dismantled by just applying maximum human force.
Which perfectly sets up the bizarre reality of chapter 6. Because they cross the river and they are immediately confronted with Jericho. And the text uses this specific, really intense phrasing. It says Jericho was straightly shut up.
Yeah, that's a great translation.
It wasn't just like on lockdown. It was bolted, barred, sealed tight. No one goes out. No one comes in.
The Canaanites are terrified, right? Because this massive nomadic camp just appeared out of nowhere. But they're deeply entrenched. They are banking on their walls to basically outlast the Israelites' patience.
And that leads to the battle plan we mentioned earlier, which completely defies all military logic. Joshua is told to have his armed men march around the perimeter of the city once a day for 6 days.
Right. But the procession is highly specific. It's not just a mob walking around. Leading the charge are 7 priests.
And they've got trumpets, right? But not the normal ones.
Exactly. Both Barnes and Henry emphasize in their commentaries that these were not the silver clarions you'd normally use to signal troop movements or, sound a battle cry.
They were ram's horns.
Yes, specifically the Jobel horns.
The Jobel horns. Wait, those are the horns used for the year of Jubilee, right?
That is exactly right.
The sound that signaled, the release of slaves and the return of ancestral lands.
That is the exact instrument. So they are blasting this ancient acoustic signal of liberation and divine promise at these massive walls. And following the priests is the Ark of the Covenant, which is the physical representation of God's presence, and then the rest of the people.
But the crazy part to me is the silence. Throughout this entire procession for 6 straight days, there is a mandate of absolute silence from all the human voices.
Complete silence.
The only sounds are just the rhythmic marching of tens of thousands of feet and the piercing blasts of those Jubilee horns. And then, on the 7th day, it intensifies. They march around the city 7 times. The priests sound a long blast. Joshua commands the people to shout, and the walls just collapse flat.
The psychological weight of those 6 days of silence is what really fascinates me.
Oh, completely. Put yourself in that scenario. I mean, in our modern context, when we face a massive obstacle like a career crisis, a financial wall, a relational breakdown, our instinct is always immediate, frantic action.
We want to do something.
Right. We want to formulate a 10-point plan. We want to talk it out. We want to start swinging a sledgehammer. And here God tells this massive assembly to literally walk in circles and keep their mouths shut.
Yeah, and to the heavily armed guards standing on those walls, it must have looked like the height of absurdity. They're probably looking down like, what are these people doing? Are they trying to bore us to death?
Seriously. Matthew Henry's commentary explores that exact psychological dynamic, actually.
Oh, yeah, he has a great take on that.
He speculates that the inhabitants of Jericho probably progressed from sheer terror on day 1 to confusion by day 3 and eventually to just arrogant mockery by day 6.
Oh, undoubtedly. They probably felt completely secure behind their masonry, just laughing at this silent parade.
But for the Israelites, that silence must have been an agonizing crucible of discipline.
It was the forced suspension of their own desire to control the narrative. I mean, they had to suppress the urge to taunt the enemy or complain about the heat or, suggest a better strategy to Joshua.
Right. Hey, Josh, maybe we should build a ladder.
Exactly. It was this profound exercise in unconventional patience. It demonstrates that true breakthroughs often require us to just outlast our own anxious impulse to force a premature result.
It's the brutal discipline of trusting the process when the process looks completely foolish to the outside world.
Yeah.
But, we cannot talk about Jericho without confronting the deeply uncomfortable aftermath.
Right. The fall of the city.
Yeah, this is where we run into a massive obstacle for the modern reader. Because once the city is breached, the text details the implementation of the cherem. The ban or the devoted thing. And the instructions are just absolute and terrifying. Every living thing in Jericho, man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep, is put to the sword.
The only exceptions are Rahab, the woman who hid the Israelite spies, and her family.
Right. Furthermore, the Israelites are strictly forbidden from taking any plunder. All the silver, gold, bronze, iron, it all goes directly into the treasury of the Lord. And the city itself is burned to ashes.
Yeah, this is undoubtedly one of the most challenging concepts in ancient literature. It requires some really careful historical parsing.
We have to look at this impartially.
We do. Because the sheer totality of the destruction, it causes a profound visceral recoil for us today. And rightfully so. It's critical that we don't attempt to sanitize this or blindly adopt it as some sort of justifiable modern military ethic.
Obviously not.
To understand the text on its own terms, we have to grasp the ancient Near Eastern theology of warfare. In that era, conflicts weren't just territorial disputes over resources. They were viewed as cosmic battles between deities.
Like the gods fighting each other through the armies.
Exactly. The concept of devoting a captured city entirely to a patron deity through complete destruction. It was a known, albeit extreme, practice in the region.
But the commentaries point out a very specific, unique theological framing for why this happened at Jericho specifically, right? Regarding the concept of the first fruits.
Yes.
I was reading Barnes on this. And he connects the destruction of Jericho directly to the agricultural laws of Israel.
That is the essential mechanism at play here. Because in the Israelite legal code, the first fruits of any harvest didn't belong to the farmer. They belonged exclusively and entirely to God. Right. And Jericho was geographically and chronologically the very first city encountered in the Promised Land. It was the first fruits of the conquest.
Ah, I see.
So by placing Jericho under the cherub, dedicating it entirely to the divine, destroying what was combustible and consecrating what was indestructible, it served as a harsh, unyielding demonstration that this land was an unearned gift.
They couldn't take credit for it.
The Israelites were absolutely prohibited from enriching themselves off this initial miraculous victory. They couldn't claim the spoils, build their own wealth, or feed their own egos with the ashes of Jericho.
That is fascinating. And translating that massive ancient concept into a modern reality forces this really interesting paradigm shift for us.
How so?
Well, we obviously aren't dealing with literal walled cities or military conquest. But think about the concept of your own first fruits. When you finally break through a major barrier in your life, like you land that massive promotion or your startup secured its first major round of funding.
Or you hit a personal milestone you've been chasing for years.
Exactly. What is your immediate reaction? Do you immediately consume that success for your own ego?
Right.
Do you buy the luxury car to show off or use that new authority to dominate others? Or do you take the first fruits of that victory and dedicate it to a higher purpose?
Do you use that initial influx of resources to help someone else?
Yes. Do you solidify your foundational values and publicly acknowledge that you didn't achieve this milestone purely by your own isolated brilliance?
That's exactly how the wisdom translates. It takes the focus off accumulation and redirects it toward dedication and gratitude.
So the practical reflection to walk away with from Jericho is twofold. First, where in your life are you currently exhausting yourself swinging a sledgehammer against an immovable wall, when maybe the wiser move is to embrace unconventional patience, walk the perimeter in silence, and trust a longer process?
That's a great question.
And second, when that wall finally does come down, are you prepared to dedicate the first fruits of that success to something larger than yourself?
And holding on to that intention is paramount, because the very next chapter demonstrates the catastrophic fallout when that dedication shattered.
Oh yeah. Chapter 7.
Chapter 7 takes us from the miraculous, ecstatic high of Jericho directly into a devastating communal tragedy. It is the perfect case study on how sudden success can breed perilous overconfidence.
The tragedy of A. The momentum is completely on Israel's side. The walls of Jericho are a smoking ruin. So Joshua sends a reconnaissance team up the mountain pass to scout the next target, this town called Ai.
And the spies return, and their report is just brimming with arrogance.
They basically tell Joshua, hey, don't even bother mobilizing the main force. Ai is insignificant. Just send 2,000 or 3,000 troops up the hill. We'll sweep them away.
They treat it like a minor administrative task.
Exactly, rather than a military engagement. They completely forgot the lesson of Jericho. They assumed the victory was a result of their new status as conquerors, rather than their reliance on divine support.
So Joshua listens to them. He sends a small detachment of 3,000 men, and the result is a total humiliating rout.
Just a disaster.
The defenders of Ai surge out of their gates, break the Israelite lines, and chase them down the steep descent, just striking them down all the way to the quarries. 36 Israelites are killed in the retreat.
And the text describes the psychological collapse of the entire nation with this chilling phrase. It says, the hearts of the people melted and became like water.
The whiplash is incredible. I mean, they just witnessed a physics-defying miracle. And a few days later, a minor skirmish completely breaks their national spirit.
Joshua is absolutely devastated. The text says he tears his clothes, falls face down on the ground before the ark, and just stays in the dirt until evening. He is locked in this agonizing lament. He's questioning the entire mission, like, why did you even bring us across the Jordan to hand us over to the Amorites to be destroyed?
And the divine response Joshua receives is incredibly abrupt. It's so pragmatic.
God essentially tells him to snap out of it.
Right. God says, get up. Why are you lying on your face? He points out that the failure at Ai wasn't a lapse in divine power, and it wasn't a tactical error in troop deployment. God delivers the diagnosis. Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant.
Notice the plural framing there. Israel has sinned.
Yes. The entire nation is held responsible for a breach in integrity.
Which brings us to the root cause. A man named Achan. During the chaotic fall of Jericho, when the cherem was in full effect and every single item was supposed to be dedicated or destroyed, Achan made a different calculation.
He did.
The text says he saw among the spoils a beautiful Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels. He coveted them, he took them, and he buried them in the dirt underneath his tent. right in the middle of the Israelite camp.
It is this profound sequence of internal decay. He saw, he coveted, he took, he hid. He prioritized his own secret enrichment over the covenantal health of his community.
And because of that one hidden act, the protective mandate over the entire nation was compromised.
Exactly. So a rigorous divine sorting process is instituted. They cast lots, moving from the tribe of Judah down to the clan to the family, and finally isolating Achan himself.
He confesses to the theft. The stolen items are dug up from his tent, proving his guilt. And the consequence is severe and absolute.
Yes. Achan, along with his sons, his daughters, his livestock, and all his possessions, are stoned and subsequently burned in a valley that is forever after named the Valley of Achor, which translates to the Valley of Trouble.
Okay, this is where the modern mind completely rebels against the text.
Oh, completely.
Why does the entire army suffer defeat, and why does Achan's entire family face execution for the secret actions of one individual? In our highly atomized, individualistic society, this feels like an outrageous miscarriage of justice. We operate under the strict assumption that guilt is strictly personal.
It absolutely grates against a 21st century Western worldview. But to understand the mechanics of this, we have to delve into the ancient concept of corporate solidarity, or what Albert Barnes beautifully articulates as the organic whole.
The organic whole.
Right. In the ancient Near East, a nation or a tribe was not perceived as a loose collection of independent contractors who merely shared a zip code.
Like we do today.
Like we do today.
Yeah.
They were a divinely constituted, deeply interconnected organism bound by a single covenantal identity.
I want to push past the usual metaphor people use for this, though. The infection in the little toe idea.
Yeah.
While true, it feels a bit cliche.
Sure.
Let's look at this through the lens of a modern ecological system.
Okay, I like that.
Imagine a pristine, incredibly balanced lake ecosystem. If one person secretly introduces a highly invasive species of fish into that lake, just a handful of them, slipped into the water in the dead of night, they might think, it's just my private action. I'm just putting a few fish in the water. What's the big deal?
Right. It seems isolated.
But within a year, that invasive species consumes the primary food source. The native fish die off, the water quality plummets, and the entire ecosystem collapses. The actions of the one secretly and fundamentally altered the environment for the whole.
That is a phenomenal way to understand the ancient mindset. Achan introduced a toxic pathogen of greed and deception into the very center of the camp, literally burying it under his tent.
Yeah.
Furthermore, Matthew Henry makes a highly practical observation regarding Achan's family.
Which is?
Given the realities of ancient nomadic tent life, it is virtually impossible that Achan could dig a hole in the floor of their shared living space, bury a large stash of loot, and conceal it without the active knowledge and complicity of his household.
Oh, wow. I never thought about that.
They harbored the secret. They tolerated the compromise.
And this destroys one of the most pervasive myths we tell ourselves today. The myth of the victimless private sin.
Yes.
We love to compartmentalize our lives. We tell ourselves, what I do on my laptop late at night, the small ethical shortcuts I take on my expense reports, the quiet resentments I nurse against a colleague, it's walled off. It only affects me.
But the tragedy of AI screams that this is a lie.
It's a total lie. There's no such thing as a purely private action when you are part of a community. Your hidden compromises absolutely leak out and dictate the health, the vitality, and the ethical ceiling of your marriage, your family, or your corporate team.
Every hidden compromise introduces rot into the floorboards of the structures you are trying to build. You simply cannot expect communal victory when you are harboring private corruption.
So the deeply uncomfortable question you have to ask yourself right now is this. What is your Babylonian garment?
What is that hidden compromise?
What is the secret habit or the unspoken ethical shortcut that you have buried underneath your tent? You might think it is perfectly concealed, but how is it silently draining the energy, the trust, and the ultimate success of the people who are relying on you?
Unearthing that hidden compromise is agonizing. But as Chapter 8 reveals, it is the absolute prerequisite for recovery.
Right. Once the camp is cleansed of Achan's deceit, the paralysis lifts, and we see exactly how a fractured community rebuilds its momentum.
And God's tone with Joshua completely changes here. The rebuke is gone. He says, do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Take the whole army and go up and attack A.
But this time, they don't rely on arrogance. They execute a highly sophisticated, brilliantly coordinated military stratagem.
It's brilliant.
Joshua takes a massive force of elite warriors and sends them by night to set up an ambush directly behind the city of A. The next morning, Joshua and the main decoy force march right up to the front gates.
And the king of Ai sees them and assumes it will be a repeat of the first battle, so he mobilizes his entire army, rushing out of the city to engage.
And Joshua and his men feign terror. They retreat back toward the wilderness, drawing the defenders further and further away from their fortifications.
It's a classic, perfectly executed feint. The city is left completely unguarded, the gates wide open.
Joshua turns and points his javelin toward Ai. That's the signal.
And the ambush force strikes.
The thousands of men in the ambush surge out of their hiding places, storm the undefended city, and set it ablaze. The men of Ai look back, see the smoke of their own city billowing into the sky, and realize they are utterly doomed. They are caught in a fatal pincer movement between the ambush force and Joshua's retreating army, which has now turned back to fight.
The victory is total and absolute. They have completely redeemed their previous catastrophic failure.
The tactical brilliance of the ambush restores their confidence. The momentum of the conquest has violently swung back into Israel's favor.
And if you are reading a standard military history, this is the precise moment the commander issues the order for a forced march to strike the next Canaanite stronghold before the enemy alliance can organize.
Right, you never ever stop when you have the enemy on their heels.
Exactly, which makes Joshua's next move completely baffling from a strategic perspective.
He hits the brakes hard.
He really does.
Immediately following the destruction of Ai, Joshua completely halts the military campaign. He organizes the entire nation, the armed soldiers, the elders, the judges, the women, the children, and even the foreigners traveling with them, and embarks on a grueling 30-mile march north.
To a valley situated between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim.
We really have to appreciate the logistics and the immense risk of this maneuver. 30 miles of travel through rugged, mountainous terrain, moving hundreds of thousands of people deep into hostile, unconquered territory.
And they aren't doing this to besiege a new city.
No. They are undertaking this massive logistical nightmare simply to build an altar of uncut stones.
It's staggering. To put that into a modern business context, imagine a disruptive startup that has just barely survived a near-fatal product launch disaster.
Okay.
They regroup, they execute a brilliant pivot, and suddenly they capture their first massive segment of market share. The competitors are terrified, the investors are thrilled, and the press is raving.
Everything's going great.
Exactly. In that exact moment, instead of pouring gasoline on the fire and aggressively expanding sales, the CEO shuts down the entire company.
Wow.
He mandates a week-long offsite for every single employee, from the executives to the interns, solely to sit in a room and meticulously review the company's founding ethical charter.
The board of directors would probably try to fire that CEO immediately.
Right. It feels like organizational suicide.
But that is the exact dynamic of the assembly at Ebal and Gerizim. Joshua builds the altar on Mount Ebal, offers sacrifices, and physically writes a copy of the Law of Moses on stones coated with plaster.
And then, utilizing the unique, natural amphitheater acoustics of the valley, he positions half the tribes on the slopes of Mount Gerizim and the other half on Mount Ebal.
And there, with the entire nation listening, he reads aloud every single word of the covenant, every blessing promised for obedience, and every curse guaranteed for rebellion.
So the question is, why do this right now? Why risk the momentum of a war to hold a massive theology seminar?
Exactly why.
Because Joshua deeply understood the mechanics of human nature. The catastrophe with Achan proved that Israel's greatest existential threat was not the Canaanite armies.
It was their own internal moral decay.
Yes. Joshua recognized that if they conquered the land without being ruthlessly anchored to their covenantal identity, the land itself would eventually corrupt and destroy them.
The pause at Mount Ebal wasn't a delay in the conquest. It was the psychological and spiritual prerequisite for surviving it.
They had to stop and remember why they were fighting and who they were supposed to be before they took another step.
We call this prioritizing the compass over the clock. And this is a massive area of conviction for how we live today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are obsessed with the clock, we are addicted to momentum. We tell ourselves constantly that we will focus on our family or our spiritual health or our core values after we finish this grueling project.
Let me just get through this quarter.
Right. Let me just secure this promotion. Let me just get the kids into college, and then I'll take time to ground myself. We treat our foundational values as a luxury item we can only afford once the war is won.
But the wisdom of chapter 8 warns us that if you continually defer your grounding, you will lose your soul in the middle of the battle. You will achieve the victory only to realize you've become someone you don't even recognize.
So how do we practically apply this? You need to systematically build the Ebal pause into the architecture of your life.
The Ebal pause, I love that.
Yeah. After your next major sprint, whether it results in a massive success or a painful failure, do not immediately rush into the next objective. Block out a weekend or even just a long afternoon. Shut down the momentum.
Review your personal mission statement.
Review it, assess your relational health, and realign your daily actions with your true north. You have to calibrate the compass before you consult the clock.
And that profound internal clarity is going to be tested immediately because as we transition into Chapter 9, the nature of the warfare fundamentally shifts.
It gets really interesting here.
It does. Israel has learned how to handle internal greed with Achan. They've learned how to recover from tactical defeat at Ai. But now they are going to face an entirely new weapon.
The devastating power of psychological deception.
Yes.
The Gibeonite deception. This is one of the most fascinating narratives in the entire text because it operates like an ancient espionage thriller.
It really does read like a spy novel.
The news of Jericho and Ai spreads rapidly across Canaan. The kings of the region realize that individual resistance is futile, so they form a massive, unified military coalition to fight Israel head-on. But the inhabitants of a major royal city called Gibeon decide that a frontal assault is suicide.
They opt for a completely different approach. The text states they resorted to a ruse.
A ruse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They understand that Israel operates under a specific divine mandate regarding the cities of Canaan, but they also know that ancient diplomatic customs allowed for peace treaties with distant nations.
So they exploit a loophole.
Exactly. So they decide to manufacture a distant origin. They engage in this elaborate piece of political theater.
And the props they use, it's incredible.
Yes, they send a delegation to Joshua's camp at Gilgal, outfitting them with incredibly specific props. They load their donkeys with worn-out sacks and old, cracked wineskins that have been mended.
The men wear threadbare garments and old, patched sandals.
And the masterpiece of their deception. They pack their travel bags with bread that is dry and visibly covered in mold.
It is brilliant stagecraft. They walk into Joshua's camp and deliver an Oscar-worthy performance. They say, hey, we have come from a very far country. In fact, we live so far away that we haven't even heard about your recent victories over Jericho and Ai.
We only heard the ancient rumors about what your God did to the Egyptians decades ago.
Right. We acknowledge your power, and we have come to offer ourselves as your servants. Make a peace treaty with us. And then they lean into the physical evidence. Look at this bread. It was warmed from the oven the day we left home. And now look at the mold. Look at our sandals, completely worn through from the endless journey.
And here we locate the fatal, catastrophic flaw in the Israelites' decision-making process. The author of Joshua records a single damning sentence. The men sampled their provisions and didn't ask counsel from the Lord's mouth.
Right.
They engaged with the physical data. They tasted the stale bread. They examined the patched leather. They listened to the compelling narrative. And they concluded that their 5 senses provided a sufficient data set to make a binding geopolitical commitment.
It is the ultimate ancient equivalent of falling for a highly sophisticated phishing scam.
Exactly.
Or dying into a completely fabricated social media persona. We look at the glossy photos, we read the perfectly crafted bio, we see the impressive metrics, and we swallow the narrative whole because the surface-level optics are so convincing.
The Israelites trusted the superficial evidence and entirely bypassed the hard work of seeking deeper, ultimate wisdom.
Precisely. Based purely on the moldy bread, Joshua makes a covenant of peace with them, and the leaders of the assembly swear a solemn oath to let them live. And the inevitable humiliation arrives just 3 days later.
3 days later, they discover that these distant travelers are actually the Gibeonites, their immediate neighbors living just a few miles up the road.
Now, this creates a massive ethical collision, and it's a point where we need to apply some serious discernment. When the general population of Israel finds out they've been conned, they're furious. They want to march on Gibeon and wipe them out.
But the leaders of Israel refuse.
They refuse. They say, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Now, therefore, we may not touch them." They choose to honor a treaty that was explicitly procured through blatant, calculated fraud. And my immediate reaction, and I think the reaction of most modern listeners, is, why?
Right. A contract based on a lie is null and void.
Exactly. Tear up the treaty.
It is a profound dilemma, and both Barnes and Henry dedicate significant commentary to unwinding it. To understand the leader's decision, we have to grasp the absolute sanctity of an oath in the ancient Near East, particularly an oath sworn in the name of a deity.
It wasn't something you could just walk back.
No. The Israelites invoked the name of Yahweh to guarantee the treaty. If they broke that oath, even though they were tricked, it would signal to every surrounding nation that the God of Israel's word was worthless and that his people lacked integrity when things became inconvenient.
So keeping the oath wasn't about validating the Gibeonites' lie. It was about preserving Israel's own internal integrity. They had to protect the weight of their own word.
Exactly. The leaders absorbed the anger of the people and the humiliation of the mistake. They spare the Gibeonites, but they relegate them to the permanent role of woodcutters and water drawers for the community, essentially drafting them into perpetual servitude for the sanctuary.
It's a harsh resolution. But the enduring wisdom here is twofold. First, the catastrophic danger of making decisions based purely on superficial optics without seeking deeper counsel.
And second, the agonizing burden of maintaining your integrity and living with the consequences when you realize you've rushed into a foolish commitment.
Because we are bombarded every single day with moldy bread, we are presented with manipulated data, slick sales pitches, charismatic leaders offering easy solutions, and relationships that demand instant commitment.
Our culture manufactures urgency to bypass our critical thinking.
Yes, and the practical mechanism to defend against this is what I like to call the 3-day rule. When you are presented with a compelling high-stakes opportunity that demands an immediate yes based on surface-level evidence, you must force a pause. Notice that the truth about the Gibeonites naturally surfaced in exactly 3 days.
Right.
So when facing a major commitment, give yourself 72 hours. Step back from the emotional pressure, consult a trusted mentor, seek spiritual or ethical clarity, and allow the initial fog of the presentation to clear.
That forced delay is a profound safeguard. And as the narrative immediately proves in Chapter 10, the consequences of skipping that delay are monumental.
Oh man, the ink on the treaty is barely dry before Israel is dragged into a massive existential conflict, entirely on behalf of the people who just conned them.
The geopolitical fallout is instant. Adoni-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, hears that Gibeon, which was a powerful, royal city, has defected and made peace with Israel.
He is terrified.
He's terrified, so he forms an alliance with 4 other Amorite kings. They combine their armies and lay siege to Gibeon to make a brutal example of them. And the Gibeonites immediately send a panicked message down to Joshua at the Gilgal camp. Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us.
This is the ultimate test of Joshua's character. He has every logistical and emotional excuse to ignore that plea. He could easily say, "You lied to me. Our treaty was a fraud. Let the Amorites wipe you out and you'll save me the trouble."
But he doesn't.
He honors the spirit of the alliance to the absolute maximum degree. He mobilizes his entire army for a brutal all-night forced march.
And we have to map the geography here to appreciate the physical toll. They are marching from Gilgal, near the Jordan River, up into the central highlands to Gibeon. It is an elevation gain of roughly 3,300 feet over a distance of about 15 to 20 miles.
Doing that in the dead of night, in ancient armor, that is an agonizing physical exertion.
But the strategy works. Joshua launches a total surprise attack at dawn, completely catching the Amorite coalition off guard.
The text describes a chaotic route. The Amorites flee down the steep descent of the pass of Beth Horon, and as they are running, the narrative introduces a massive divine intervention. God hurls massive hailstones from the sky, killing more of the fleeing soldiers than the Israelites killed with their swords.
But even with the surprise attack and the catastrophic hailstorm, Joshua faces a critical tactical problem. Daylight is fading. The terrain is incredibly rugged, full of caves and ravines. If the sun goes down, the remnants of the massive Amorite coalition will escape into the darkness, regroup, and the war will drag on for years.
Joshua needs absolute final victory on this specific day.
And this leads to arguably the most famous, debated, and visually stunning moment in the entire book.
Right in the heat of the pursuit, Joshua looks up and makes an impossibly audacious request in front of the entire army. He shouts, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon." And the text declares the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day until the nation avenged itself on its enemies.
Let's pause and really unpack the mechanics of this because it has been a battleground for commentators and scientists for centuries. How do we responsibly interpret this text today?
Let's have fun.
Albert Barnes provides a deeply nuanced historical framework that is incredibly helpful here. While historical literalists have sought to explain this via shifts in the Earth's rotation or unique light refraction, many serious biblical scholars point to a crucial parenthetical note embedded right in the text itself. The author writes, "Is it not written in the Book of Jashar?"
The Book of Jashar, what exactly is that?
The Book of Jashar was an ancient collection of national poetry. It was an anthology of heroic odes and songs celebrating Israel's leaders. It was not a literal chronological history book. It was poetic literature designed to capture the emotional and spiritual magnitude of an event.
Interesting.
Barnes argues that Joshua's command and the subsequent description of the sun standing still is an excerpt from this poetic anthology. It is a brilliant, poetic expression of a profound internal human experience.
Indeed.
When you are engaged in work of absolute critical importance and you are operating at the peak of your focus and capability, time subjectively expands. The poetic imagery of the sun freezing in the sky perfectly captures the lived reality of a day where an impossible amount of crucial work was accomplished through divine assistance.
That interpretation makes the wisdom so much more accessible. Whether a reader views it as a literal astronomical anomaly or a majestic poetic metaphor for divine empowerment, the core, actionable insight remains identical.
The power of the audacious request.
Yes. When you are physically exhausted, having marched uphill all night to honor a difficult commitment, and you know you are perfectly aligned with a just and righteous cause, you possess the moral authority to ask for the impossible. You can ask for the sun to stand still.
It is the ultimate expression of faith intersecting with extreme human effort. However, the chapter does not end with the poetic triumph of the sun. It concludes with a scene that is intensely visceral and often deeply upsetting for modern readers.
Yes, the aftermath in the cave. The 5 Amorite kings who led the coalition managed to flee the battle and hide in a cave at Makkedah. Joshua is informed, and he orders large stones rolled against the mouth of the cave, trapping them inside while the army finishes the pursuit.
Once the battlefield is quiet, Joshua returns. He orders the cave opened and the 5 kings brought out.
And then he issues a chilling command. He calls for his military captains to step forward and physically place their feet directly on the necks of these defeated kings.
It is a stark, dominating image of absolute subjugation. And again, we must apply rigorous historical discernment to understand the mechanics of what Joshua is doing. This was not merely an act of sadistic cruelty or random violence. It's symbolic, highly symbolic. In the visual language of the ancient Near East, placing a foot on the neck of a vanquished enemy was a highly formalized ritual. It represented the total transfer of power and the absolute humiliation of the conquered.
But why make his captains do it? Why not just execute them and be done with it?
Because of the psychological trauma of the Israelites. Remember our data points from the beginning. These captains were born in the desert. For their entire lives, the kings of Canaan were the ultimate bogeymen.
They represented impenetrable walls, advanced weaponry, and terrifying power.
The Israelites had lived in the shadow of that fear for decades. By forcing his captains to physically place their boots on the necks of these men, Joshua was engineering a radical psychological breakthrough.
He was breaking the spell of terror.
He was viscerally demonstrating to his leaders the very forces that paralyzed your parents in fear are now completely physically under your control. They have no power over you anymore.
That translates into a profound internal mechanism for us today, because the modern application is not about asserting dominance over other human beings. It is entirely about internal psychological subjugation.
Yes, subjugating our own fears.
We all have Amorite kings hiding in the caves of our subconscious. We have deep-seated insecurities, crippling anxieties, toxic behavioral loops, or addictions that have dictated our choices for years. We let them rule us. The wisdom here is that you cannot just negotiate with those fears.
You cannot just leave them hidden in the cave.
You have to drag them out into the light, confront them directly, and assert absolute, unyielding control over them. You have to put your foot on the neck of your own greatest fear and declare, you no longer dictate the terms of my life.
It is the necessary psychological victory that must accompany any external success. And they needed every ounce of that newfound confidence because the campaign is far from over.
The Southern Coalition is broken. But as we move into the final chapters of our deep dive, chapters 11 and 12, the ultimate technological and military threat emerges from the north.
The Northern Campaign. The Southern kings were defeated, but the North is a different beast entirely. Jabin, the king of Hazor, hears about Joshua's victories. Hazor is essentially the superpower of the region.
Right.
Jabin sends envoys across the entire northern landscape, assembling a coalition that dwarfs anything Israel has faced. The text describes a combined army gathered at the waters of Merom as a massive horde, in number like the sand on the seashore.
But the sheer numbers aren't the terrifying part. The text specifically highlights that they possessed very many horses and chariots.
Up to this point, the Israelite campaigns have been infantry battles in the rugged central highlands, where chariots are basically useless. But the waters of Merom is in the north, near the plains. This introduces a terrifying shift in military technology.
In the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, the chariot was the ultimate weapon of mass destruction.
It was a mobile firing platform that could shatter infantry lines with terrifying speed and psychological shock. It represented the pinnacle of imperial military dominance.
But Joshua does not wait to be attacked. In a hallmark of his tactical style, he launches a massive, unexpected surprise attack, falling on the coalition at Merom before they can properly deploy their chariots. The Israelite infantry overruns the camp, and they achieve a stunning, comprehensive victory.
But it's what happens after the battle that we really want to drill into.
Because God gives Joshua a deeply counterintuitive command regarding all this captured military hardware. God tells him to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire, and Joshua executes the order perfectly.
Which is wild.
Now, I have to bring some serious pushback here. From a strategic geopolitical standpoint, burning the chariots borders on malpractice. You just defeated a superpower and captured their tanks. If you want to secure the land you just conquered, you integrate those tanks into your own army. Why destroy the ultimate military advantage?
It is a brilliant question, and to answer it, we have to pull in comparative insight from earlier in the biblical text, specifically the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17. In that text, Moses outlines the laws for the future kings of Israel. And there is a highly specific, explicit prohibition.
What does it say?
The king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them.
Why the connection to Egypt?
Because in the cultural memory of Israel, horses and chariots were not just neutral tools of war. They were the signature technology of the Egyptian empire. They were the literal instruments used to enforce their centuries of slavery. The chariot was the physical embodiment of oppressive, human-centric imperial power. God forces Joshua to burn the chariots because he knows the seductive mechanics of power. If Israel absorbed the chariots into their military, they would slowly transition from a covenant community relying on divine provision into a standard, brutal, militaristic empire.
They would become the very oppressors they had just defeated.
Exactly. They had to destroy the weapons of empire to protect the soul of their nation.
That is a staggering insight, and it provides one of the most powerful modern translations of our entire deep dive. Think about the mechanics of how you operate in your career, your industry, or even your personal conflicts. Let's say you are competing against a deeply toxic rival.
They utilize cutthroat tactics, manipulation, deceit, and aggressive dominance.
Those are their chariots. Through immense effort, integrity, and resilience, you manage to defeat them. You win the market share, or you secure the promotion. In the immediate aftermath of that victory, there is a massive, seductive temptation to look at their toxic methods and think, well, their tactics are clearly effective. To protect my new position at the top, maybe I need to start operating like they do. Maybe I need to keep a few chariots for myself.
It is the overwhelming temptation to adopt the culture of your enemy simply because it feels like a safer way to maintain control.
Exactly. But the burning of the chariots at Merom screams a different truth. True wisdom recognizes that if you adopt the toxic methods of your defeated rivals to secure your success, you destroy the core values that made your success meaningful in the first place.
You have to burn the chariots.
You have to actively destroy and reject those toxic tools of dominance, and trust that the integrity and foundational values that got you to the top are sufficient to keep you there.
It requires an immense amount of internal courage to look at what the world defines as the ultimate advantage and intentionally set it on fire to preserve your own soul. But as we have mapped out across these chapters, the architecture of true victory is profoundly countercultural.
We have covered massive philosophical and historical ground today. We started by examining the wisdom of unconventional patience at Jericho, the agonizing discipline of remaining silent and trusting the process when it feels like you are merely walking in circles.
We confronted the painful reality of the cherem, learning to dedicate the first fruits of our breakthroughs to a higher purpose rather than consuming them for our own ego.
We analyzed the communal tragedy of AI, shattering the myth of the victimless private sin. We realized that our hidden compromises, our buried Babylonian garments, inevitably rot the floorboards of our communities.
We learn the absolute necessity of the Ebal pause, the discipline of halting our momentum to prioritize our moral compass over the ticking clock.
We were warned by the Gibeonite deception about the immense peril of trusting superficial optics, the moldy bread of our culture, and the vital importance of utilizing the 3-day rule to seek deeper counsel.
We witness the audacity of faith in the Valley of Ajalon, learning to make impossible requests when aligned with justice, and the psychological necessity of placing our feet squarely on the necks of our deepest internal fears.
And finally, we saw the profound courage required to burn the chariots of toxic success.
And all of these complex, demanding narratives culminate in a single, quiet phrase at the very end of chapter 11. After detailing the brutal, exhausting years of the northern and southern campaigns, the text concludes with this sentence. Then the land had rest from war.
Rest from war.
In our modern lives, we expend an unbelievable amount of energy fighting for external stability. We war for financial security, we battle for career advancement, we fight for relational peace. But true rest is never merely the absence of external conflict. As the book of Joshua demonstrates, true rest is the profound internal peace that only arrives when we know we have navigated our struggles with unyielding integrity.
It is the peace that comes when we have unearthed our hidden compromises, honored our difficult commitments, confronted our deepest anxieties, and absolutely refused to rely on the chariots of our enemies.
Exactly.
The ultimate question you are left to ponder as you look at the towering walls and the complex battlefields of your own life is this. Are you fighting merely to win the battle at any cost? Or are you fighting with the kind of integrity that will actually allow your soul to achieve true rest?
It's a question we all have to answer.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.